Hi, everyone. I'm Juliana Costa. I'm from Federal University of São Paulo and from Articulação Sul, which is a think tank on South-South cooperation and learning. We are here this evening for a panel about South-South cooperation and trilateral cooperation. Today we have two panelists which will present their papers. Once again, I would like to thank for Osmani and all the organization staff for the invitation here. Here we have two panelists. One is Mariana Rios, which will present digital platforms for South-South cooperation, Laboppi knowledge translation of Brazilian social policies, and Vinicius Guilherme Rodrigues Vieira, between growth and protection, the limits of multilateral development banks in hindering carbon emissions. Which panelist will have 20 minutes for their presentation. Then I will comment the paper and will pass questions from audience. All questions are welcome here on chat. I will follow during the presentation and will pass for them. And then they will have more 15 minutes to have their considerations and answer the questions, okay? And then I will conclusion our panel. Good work for all of us, good discussions, and okay. Mariana, are you ready?
I'm here, Juliana. So, hi everyone. First of all, thank you, Juliana, for introducing me and for coordinating this panel. I also want to thank the organizers and the staff of the Second International Conference on Policy Diffusion and Development Cooperation for their support and also for giving me this opportunity to present my research. Now I'm going to share my presentation. There it goes. So we are Mariana Rios and Rodrigo Pires from the University of Brasilia, UNB. We developed this study as my final paper of the specialization course in international relations. And now I'm going to talk about, as Juliana just said, digital platforms for South-South cooperation, especially about the case study of the WWP knowledge translation of Brazilian social policies. So digital platforms for South-South cooperation are policy networks based on information and communication technologies, such as websites, portals, and gateways. They aim to strengthen policy diffusion among developing countries, providing knowledge and mutual learning by means of digital materials, webinars, discussion forums, online training courses, and interactions on social networks. These online platforms disseminate low-cost, accessible, inclusive, and autonomous knowledge expertise. They involve state and non-state actors such as international organizations, research centers, and think tanks, and are presented in bilateral and triangular cooperation formats. Some examples, as you see, are the socialprotection.org, the South-South Galaxy, the South-South Global Thinkers, and the Brazil Learning Initiative for a World Without Poverty, the WWP, which is the main object of this study. So despite all the potential involved, there are some challenges to be addressed. One example is how can these digital platforms for South-South cooperation better capture and document public policy experiences so that other countries adapt them to their realities and meet a real need? The literature review identified another challenge. There is an increasing number of research focused on knowledge diffusion. However, little has been addressed on knowledge translation. As a consequence, there is also a gap in empirical analysis on knowledge translation undertaken by digital platforms for South-South cooperation. Taking this gap into account, what are the possibilities of knowledge translation in digital platforms for South-South cooperation? This evolved into our hypothesis that to be successful, translation must be transversal to policy transfer, preceding and also succeeding diffusion. So we came up with this paper, whose main objective is to explore the possibilities of knowledge translation in digital platforms for South-South cooperation, starting from an analysis of the Brazil Learning Initiative for a World Without Poverty. The main question to be addressed is how did the WWP translate the knowledge of Brazilian social policies? So firstly, there was a research gap in this field that needed to be identified and explored so that it can target empirical issues on knowledge translation. And then we interviewed 5 WWP former staff members about the initiative's knowledge translation. The literature review. In short, knowledge translation is an intermediary process to avoid incomplete and inadequate transfers and diffusions. According to Professor Osmani Porto de Oliveira, without some kind of translation, policies simply would not fit into different contexts, nor would be accepted by heterogeneous groups. As claimed by Baba, this space of translation is a spot of hybridity, which reshapes each political object in relation to the other. Translation, as stated by Kuhlman et al., can also be seen as a stage of the flow of policies, where actors that are going to receive the policy acquire new knowledge from other contexts and transform these into their own policy legacies. A brief explanation of the WWP. So it was a digital platform active from 2013 to 2017, whose main goal was to disseminate Brazilian poverty reduction strategies and social policies. It aimed to connect practitioners to deliver social programs in developing countries. Its website was a repository of knowledge made available in different formats, digital publications, videos, newsletters, webinars, and so on, and in 4 languages, Portuguese, French, Spanish, and English. There you can find 80 technical articles, all of those available in those 4 languages, whose content covers almost 30 different Brazilian social policies. It was funded by the World Bank and managed by the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth, ICPDDC, the Institute for Applied Economic Research of Brazil, IPEA, and the Ministry of Social Development of Brazil, the current Ministry of Citizenship. WWP knowledge products were based on the know-how and expertise of its partners in delivering systems and implementing programs. The knowledge generation process was settled by a multi-stakeholder governance structure composed of 3 committees: editorial, technical, and communication, which were in charge of producing, also validating, and approving the WWP materials. As shown, as you can see on the right side of the slide, the content was generated according to one of these 7 thematic axes, following the 3 different levels of knowledge. WWP knowledge translation, the main concern of it was to facilitate the comprehension of the so-called how-to approach, which means how the program works or how to do something similar in a different country. Following this guideline, the content was based on a script composed of a set of topics that should be covered, as you see again on the right side of the slide, such as goals, monitoring and evaluation strategies, so on. So WWP publications sought to be objective, didactic, avoiding any technicalities that could hinder or confuse the understanding by foreigners. Also illustrative, with the use of graphs, tables, flowcharts, relevant and updated. In order to provide more information to the qualitative analysis, this study carried out 5 semi-structured interviews with professionals directly involved in the knowledge production at WWP. All respondents agreed that WWP materials were high quality, efficient, and positive. They also highlighted the concern of facilitating the replication in different contexts. So WWP publications should stimulate understanding of other countries about the dimension of institutional, legal, legislative, and political arrangements taken by Brazil in the consolidation of its public policies. They also pointed the high-skilled experts on Brazilian social policies and the mutual learning environment encouraged by this multi-stakeholder governance structure as fundamental to guarantee the quality of the publications. They also agreed that WWP material served as a guide for public policy managers at national and also subnational levels. However, knowledge translation has partially fulfilled its purpose. Firstly, all respondents agreed that there was a lack of self-criticism about Brazilian social policies because they were afraid, the institutions were afraid of the political impact of admitting failures or exposing vulnerabilities in the implementation of the program. Secondly, some respondents believed that there should have been a greater effort to record lessons learned and mishaps in the implementation of social programs. They could have contributed even more efficiently to the transfer of policies to the countries of the South. Thirdly, all respondents questioned the real impact that WWP knowledge translation had in stimulating the implementation of social policies in countries of the Global South. They complained about the lack of establishing dissemination goals as well as monitoring and evaluation strategy. Last but not least, they differ on the understanding that the WWP would be responsible itself for ensuring the successful transfer of its knowledge. For some, the knowledge receiving country is responsible for adapting the content provided to enable policy implementation. For others, it would be necessary to have more knowledge exchange between Brazil and the other countries of the South through the WWP digital platform, which should have become a more interactive environment. Some even believed that if the WWP had evolved to document not only Brazilian experiences, but also those of other countries in the South, the initiative could have stayed active longer. My final considerations: to sum up, this study has found that there is a research gap on knowledge translation within the scope of public policy transfer. There is also a gap in empirical analysis on knowledge translation undertaken by digital platforms for South-South cooperation, such as the WWP. And based on the 5 semi-structured interviews we carried out, this study has found that despite all the effort made by WWP to translate knowledge of Brazilian social policies in a robust set of materials and publications, it didn't succeed in its main goal of reaching the target audience and transferring policies from Brazil to other countries. A lack of self-criticism, as I've just said, and of documenting lessons learned threatened the translation of Brazilian social policies promoted by the initiative. These 2 factors were influenced by the fear of the political impact of admitting failures or exposing vulnerabilities in the implementation of Brazilian social policies. Finally, I hope this work has enriched the reflection from a perspective based on empirical and theoretical contributions from the South about the challenge of translating public policies for actors as heterogeneous as those involved in South-South cooperation, as we know, and an environment as plural, democratic, and innovative as the internet. Here you can see my references. You can check them out later. And thanks again for having me presenting this topic in this amazing panel. I look forward to learning from the upcoming presentation. This is my mail. Feel free to contact me anytime. Now I'm gonna stop my presentation and I'm gonna head back to Juliana.
Thank you, Mariana. Your presentation was amazing and very fruitful. Now I will present Vinicius with the name of his paper about development banks. Okay, Vinicius, we are glad to have you here, and you have 20 minutes. One more time for audience, questions are available all time. I will make notes and then pass to our panelists, okay? Thanks. Vinicius.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliana. Thank you very much for the organizers for hosting this conference, even though we are facing very huge problems, as you know very well. So my paper is actually a co-author paper with a colleague from Spain, Anastasia Bedenkova. She's not here. We have a series of papers associated to multilateral development banks, and one of the papers happens to be the one that I'm going to present today, called Between Growth and Protection, the Limits of Multilateral Development Banks in Hindering Carbon Emissions. So, whenever we talk about development banks, we often tend to think of the World Bank and the environmental standards that the World Bank Group has imposed over its projects in general. Projects and also, of course, loans, grants, whatever forms of resources that the World Bank provides. The World Bank, or better said, the most well unit of the World Bank, the construction and development, the which we often equate with the World Bank, but the World Bank has several divisions. But the EBRD has environmental policy frameworks since 2001. However, as you may know very well, particularly those who are more akin to study the global south, the multilateral game of finance, or the game of multilateral finance, has changed quite a lot since the foundation of the World Bank in the aftermath of World War II. There are other US sponsored multilateral development banks. When I'm talking about the Inter American Bank, for instance, that is well known here in Brazil. I'm going to mention other banks in a few minutes. But in academic terms, it's worth reminding that those banks, they are often studied along with the World Bank. Although, as we're going to see, they have a very specific characteristics. There are, of course, a few exceptions, works that are nevertheless quite broad, and we're not concerned about assessing specific policies. I'm here talking about the works from Cebrap and Ruth Ben-Artsy. Those are two amazing books that I really recommend for those who are more interested in the topic of multilateral development banks, and particularly the banks that are sponsored by the United States apart from the World Bank. And in sponsoring those banks, of course, United States is the liberal hegemon. It has not really relied only on its own resources. For this, United States has bilateral flows of aid, bilateral flows of development, other forms of shaping policy around the world. The interesting thing about the banks is that in case of the regional ones, unlike the World Bank, they target specific regions of the world. I mentioned here for us in Latin America, assuming that a relevant part of the audience is from Brazil or our neighborhood, South America, Latin America, the Inter-American Development Bank. But we also have banks that are focused on Africa, on Asia, and that are also sponsored by the United States and its key allies in Western Europe, plus Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the global north. However, unlike in the case of the World Bank Group, the recipient countries, also called regional members or borrowing members, they also contribute with a relevant share of the resources that are used for loans. So, for instance, Brazil and Argentina, each of them has about 10% in the Inter American Development Bank. So, we have to consider, or at least to assume, or if we cannot assume, we must design hypotheses that account for this difference between U.S. Development banks, U.S. sponsored development banks, in regional terms, in multilateral terms. Here, just to give you a snapshot, we have here in green in Latin America the recipient states of the Inter-American Development Bank. Just a minor correction here. It was founded not in 1950 but in 1959, well before concerns with the environment started to arise. So it has established a proper environmental policy framework well before, a few years before the EBRD, the World Bank. The IADB has established this framework in 94. Here in dark red, we have the countries that are only sponsors. They furnish money, they contribute to those banks. Nevertheless, they do not borrow resources. Only Latin American countries can borrow resources. Likewise, in Asia, there are external members, non-regional members, including Turkey, that though it's an Asian, partially European, but partially Asian country, it's just a contributor to the Asian Development Bank. Was founded a few years later after the Inter-American Development Bank in the context of the Cold War. They were tools through which United States and Europe plus Japan aimed to retain allies on their side against the competition for power with the Soviets at that time. And the ASDB established its environmental policy framework in 2002. Last but not least, out of those most known banks, we have the African Development Bank that was founded in 64. Nevertheless, it was basically a regional, proper regional enterprise. But as in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, went through the debt crisis, they had to rely on Western finance. That's when Western countries started to contribute in the 70s, and finally in 83, it incorporates the United States, and it surprisingly for many, it is actually the first bank out of all banks sponsored by the United States that has established an environmental policy framework, and it has done so in 1990. So here we formulated the following argument that borrowing membership of regional multilateral development banks and the EBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that actually increases CO2 emissions, carbon emissions, contingent upon a country's GDP per capita. So to phrase it in a very clear way, the higher the GDP per capita, the likely is that an MDB environmental policy is able to reduce emissions in that given country. And why that's the case? Well, we have several reasons to expect this. We're going to detail a few of that in a minute. But before that, I think it's important to anticipate a little bit few of our our policy implications. First of all, in environmental studies, people often talk about the ATC framework, according to which states have higher degrees of environmental pollution and therefore carbon emissions at the onset of their developmental trajectories with a low GDP per capita. But we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing that higher countries with higher GDP per capita, they are more likely to make emissions. And we also have here a problem about the goals of regional MDBs, regional multilateral development banks, and the EBRD as well, as you're going to see when I show you our statistical analysis. Uh, those policy frameworks are not being effective simply because they are actually stimulating emissions, or if they are not stimulating emissions, they are not able to hinder those emissions as it's originally their intent. Before moving towards our hypothesis, let's analyze a little bit our series of descriptive data. Here we have billions of cubic meters of CO2. Africa, Asia, and Latin America, they witness, well, with the exception of Africa, that starts increasing only in the 2000s with China's rise, but Asia and Latin America starts polluting more and more after a gap in the 80s and the 90s as globalization moves forwards and those countries enter global value chains in more depth. However, if we break down the emissions according to membership of those banks in the global south, here we're just talking about the borrowing members, the states in the global south, we see that non-members, they tend to increase their emissions vis-a-vis the members of those development banks, what suggests that the frameworks are quite effective, given that most of them were established here in this period between in the transition from the 20th to the 21st century. Uh, Here we therefore have some hypotheses. First, regional MDBs, environmental policies, are expected to decrease CO2 emissions, and EBRD environmental policies expected to do the same. However, that's conditional to two main issues according to our framework. The degree of political power of a state, more powerful states may be able to reduce, as I'm going to show you here in the other hypothesis, their levels of CO2 because they are more powerful, so they don't feel obliged to follow the rules imposed by United States and and its allies. And we measure state power with SYNC. SYNC is a quite well-known measure in international relations. It's a composite index of national capabilities, basically measures of economic and military power. And we expect that the opposite effect exists in the EBRD, the IBRD. Why? Because the United States and its allies, they are more powerful. So even the most powerful states from the global south, like Brazil, India, China, they have no other choice but really to reduce their emissions, at least when you're talking about a membership of the IBRD. Here we have a hint about why GDP per capita may matter in hindering the effects of environmental policy frameworks. The higher GDP per capita, the higher is the level of emissions, and the slope here shows that it's a strong correlation. However, correlation is not causation. That's why we run more complex regressions, not just correlations between two variables. But before showing you the results, let me just show you those two hypotheses that pretty much summarize our main findings. Regional MDBs, environmental policies, are associated with increasing CO2 emissions in varying members with high GDP per capita, and IBRD environmental policies associated with increasing CO2 emissions in varying members with high GDP per capita as well. So our research design comprises a dependent variable that is continuous. Here we have CO2 tons of cubic meters of CO2. Here we have independent variables 0, 1, 1 if a state is a borrowing member, and a borrowing member after a bank adopted environmental policy. Regional M being borrowing member also after the adoption of environmental policy, it's a dummy. 1 if it's yes, 0 if it's no. GDP per capita, the composite index of national capabilities, funding. We are not talking about funding yet. However, as I'm going to show you, there are no effects at all of funding over the dependent variable. And the Freedom House index, that is a measure of democracy. As many studies have already found, that more democratic states are more likely to reduce their emissions simply because authorities are more accountable and therefore they are more responsive to the population's demands on health matters. We use some time lags simply because some of those variables may be endogenous with each other, so time lag, time difference may be a strategy to avoid, to circumvent endogeneity. Let's move forward here. Yep, sorry. Here, the research design comprises 2 samples between 73 2009, Asia and Latin America only, because only after 83 US becomes AFDB sponsor, and as part of our broader project, what we aim to assess is really the impact of United States sponsorship over those multilateral development banks. Here we have some results. First for Asia and Latin America. Here we have 2 models, a model without GDP per capita and a full model with GDP per capita. So here we have an year time -1, year -1. Here we have under environmental policy with significant effects, reducing emissions as predicted. However, once we interact membership of the IBRD with under environmental policy with the state's capacity, military capacity, and economic capacity measured by the sink, here we have a negative effect. However, the effect is the opposite whenever we interact membership with GDP per capita here, and the effects are quite significant. That persists whenever we add African countries to the sample. Those results are significant. Here also, this interaction term between IBRD and SYNC also it loses slightly. Well, sorry, it doesn't lose statistical significance. The interesting thing is that once we add African countries, SYNC per se is correlated positively with emissions, what suggests that actually the most powerful countries, generally regional powers, they may shield themselves regardless of membership in MDBs. They refrain themselves from following norms that imply reducing emissions. Here we finally have a robustness check. How can we conduct a robustness check? Here we only analyze, we only include in the sample only the Latin American and Asian countries that were already members of the ASDB, the Asian Development Bank, or members in case of the Latin American countries of the Inter-American Development Bank, the IADB. By the time those banks adopted their environmental policy frameworks, 2002 for the Asian Development Bank, 94 for the Inter-American Development Bank. Here we no longer have the significance. Here there is no significance. The coefficients here of membership of regional MDBs. However, the interaction term here, membership of regional MDB and GDP per capita is still significant. So this is actually the strongest effect that we find, apart from one that has not been considered alone by the hypothesis, but that nevertheless is relevant because it's the sink. That means that, again, the most powerful states refrain from following environmental norms. So to wrap up, certainly MDP, environmental policy, they are not relevant. However, the impact tend to be higher in countries with lower GDP per capita. And here we can open several debates on this, on whether the way those environmental policy frameworks are crafted, they actually hinder development as a whole, whether they are not providing alternatives to development through sustainable development measures. But that's another paper, that's another project. But it's worth discussing this perhaps in the questions and answers. Perhaps we should add specific conditionalities. That's, however, this stage impossible. Our project is more focused on the macro level. Moreover, assessing specific conditionalities depends on doing archival research on the files of those development banks, something that is quite impossible amidst the pandemic. Last but not least, I think all the findings here, plus the current literature on MDBs, makes us wonder to what extent the new development banks, the new multilateral development banks led by China, namely the BRICS Bank, the MDB, New Development Bank, plus the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, to what extent they stimulate emissions or they hinder emissions. Both banks, they do have environmental policy, environmental and social standards largely copied from the US-led multilateral development banks. However, we are not sure whether that's just something that is in their treaties, in the treaties that organize those banks, and to what extent those measures actually have an impact. So thank you very much. Please take note of my email. I'd be very happy to interact with yourselves, and I look forward to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinicius. Thank you. First of all, I would like to encourage all our audience to question our panelists for me just not talk alone here. They made very interesting presentations, so please welcome to have your questions, okay? But, so I will comment first of all Mariana's paper. I will not have some questions because all of our panelists and papers are very good. I just make suggestions or comments on their papers, okay? First of all, I would like to welcome all the questions and all the papers that are here in this panel. So Marianas, I like so much your paper, because here is a thing that we are researchers on South cooperation are very worried about and question about what are the role of international organizations in this kind of knowledge, not only knowledge transfer, but knowledge translation, what you called in your paper. And double P panel, it's a good idea, but like others that you talk, like South Galaxy from UNOSC, that is the office from United Nations for South cooperation, that have the mission to do this kind of thing, to translate and to diffuse all the good practice about South cooperation, not only did by countries, but what did by researchers. In Articulação Sul, they did research on comparative study between Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil about their South-South cooperation institutionalization, and then about the fight for COVID with COVID. So it was a good paper for us to do, and it's a good thing to do. So, but the problem with this kind of platforms and things like that is the audience, because the governments and people from governments don't have so much time, and even more in some kind of this interested in this kind of research. So this mission of going to translate public policies to other countries or to diffuse, share knowledge, are compromised. So it's a problem. It's a problem that can be viewed if we have, like you said, good mechanisms of kind of monitoring and evaluation and things like this. All international organizations have their only mechanisms of M&A. So I think what we can have to do for this is have more accurate M&E platforms or mechanisms to capture this kind of failure. I know it's a failure, but is an error of the designing of the platform and all the strategies like webinars and things like that, to design more accurate platforms. I'm not only from international relations, I'm a public relations too. So when you talk about audience, this is a problem for us from international relations and social applied sciences that we don't have so much knowledge about. So I think for all these kind of platforms, they need a communications experts to draw, to design platforms that have this appeal to our government authorities, for them to be pleased and to be interested in this kind of things. Okay. PNUD and all UNDP and all the UN organizations and agencies do this kind of thing, like sharing and inviting people from governments to discuss this kind of things. But what we can see is that the discussions don't mean that what they learned or what they discussed will be public policy, or will have concrete implementation. So this is a problem with this kind of platforms. But besides that, beyond all of these problems, I think this is a huge arm for us to share our knowledge, to discuss things like South-South cooperation, and to discuss what Global South are doing in their public realm. Because in Brazil, we have a kind of South-South cooperation that is different from South-South cooperation from China, from India, and from other countries, that is the capacity development. So what is capacity development? Is knowledge sharing. We share our knowledge with our partners. Brazilians don't like things like donors and the vertical cooperation. So this kind of platforms is a thing for this, that we can do to share this knowledge, to help them to develop their capacities. So I think we can improve this kind of mechanism. So WWP is doing a thing that is so good. We can. It's not to throw them all. It's just to improve this, to have an M&E good plan, to know what the audience wants to know and wants to see, to capture this audience. I think it's a huge thing to do, but I think it's a thing that we can have to do. So even not just WWP, but all the kind of these platforms, because we saw here in our pandemic context that we have to learn, and we will use so much more our digital gadgets and things, uh, that it's a good thing for us to share our practice, to share our knowledge. Here we are doing a conference just digitally, without seeing each other. So it's a good thing to do. It's a good way of doing this. We just have to know how to do this, because what is going on now, it's because all this knowledge are there, are good, but are just available or are just consulted by academics, by researchers, uh, not by their uh, target group, that are the public policies managers. So we have to have this study of what these people want coming up to see these kind of policies. I think for me, it's just a hint. It's not, I don't have any academic or accurate uh, accurate knowledge about this. I think it's because they don't know. They don't know that this platform exists. So the work for these people is just to present this kind of mean to do this. So I think it's a good way to do. It's a good way to present these platforms and use this platform. Go to these managers and these people, our politicians and our bureaucrats, to present this kind of platform. It's not a good, it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's the way we can do this thing, and to compromise and to accomplish the mission of this kind of platforms. And then with this, we can uh, translate and diffuse public policies to the benefit of what we want, that is the society. Because if we share knowledge and if we share public policies very well, the most beneficiary is our society, is people, are our people in Earth. So I think this is the challenge for these international organizations and this kind of digital platforms. It's to present their platforms for people who make decisions, who are the people responsible for the decisions, and for them to use these platforms to share their knowledge with other governments, with other decision makers. So this will form what is our dream, a, a huge network of not only researchers or uh, academics, professors, or people that are interested in this kind of things, so we can have uh, uh, an important thing that is the knowledge transfer and knowledge sharing. Okay, like I said, I just make comments and not questions, okay? But then I will pass the words for Mariana to comment things that I said, and another additional comments with their paper, for their paper, and then I will comment Vinicius' paper, okay? Audience, anyone have any kind of comment or question for Mariana? Here we have a question from Osmani, Mariana. The Osmani are saying if your research offers insights about the relations between these platforms, and I think they are the power and the policy translation. That if the people from power, decision makers, are using platforms, I think it's this. Is that it, Osmani? I'm thinking well. Mariana.
Are you hearing me? Okay, so thank you, Juliana, so much for all of your suggestions and considerations. You pointed out so many important, actually, dilemmas that policy makers, institutions, and stakeholders they face every day. You pointed very, very important dilemmas. And actually, I'm not sure if I can add more information, but thank you so much. As you said, those platforms, they release a massive volume of information, and this concern of what the institutions, what the audience can do with that is the basic concern. And this is something that can evolve to more complex reflections, such as the one that we brought on our article, that how can policy be better translate to other heterogeneous contexts, such as the ones we see on the South, on the global South, in the many different developing countries that we have. There is something interesting about WWP is that the audience was great, actually. on their final activity report. They pointed out all their numbers for views and downloads of materials, and actually they did very well numbers in terms of diffusion, but they cannot, as I said, as they couldn't develop strategies to monitoring and evaluation their work, or to better capture the interest of the audience, or how those information, those policy guidelines could have been implemented in other contexts. So they couldn't track what other policymakers were doing worldwide with the information they were providing online. And so this is something interesting that we reflected. For example, as we could understand with the interviews we carried out, that translation is a process that should gain importance during the whole process of implementing a policy, and not only just by the country that is providing information, providing knowledge, providing expertise, but especially for the country that is receiving. So the main desire of the WWP staff was that the platform could evolve to a more interactive environment, so that they could there could have been more actually mutual learning, as we suppose to have had in a digital platform. And answering Osmani's question, yes, we actually during our interviews, we could ask the WWP staff about the political impact on the translation, on the policy translation. And something that we realized was exactly what threatened the policy translation, and could threaten also the policy transfer, which was the institutions such as the federal government of Brazil and the World Bank that was funding that initiative. They were feared that they could be misunderstood, or that the political situation that Brazil were facing between the change of government from Dilma to Temer and then Bolsonaro, that political context could impact on the translation. And actually that was the main cause, they believed, that was the main cause that the initiative could stay longer. So we kind of just give an overview about the relation between power and policy and politic context, and the impact of these on the policy translation, and especially the policy transfer. So Yes, I believe so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. I think the people from P would have to see our panel to know better, or to see your contributions, because your paper is so good. Okay. I think they want to what they want to do is that a decision maker from a small city from Brazil make contact with someone in the middle of Africa, but this is so difficult to do. Uh, it's a problem with the whole south to do this. Okay, but now, last but not least, the Vinicius paper that is so different from Mariana. Mariana, it's a qualitative paper that it's good. The Vinicius paper is a quantitative one with regressions and things like that. I remember it when I read your paper about my researches when I was in my PhD. So it was too good to see your paper and to read. It's difficult to do think like that, quantitative research in international relations. So I welcomed your paper to do this kind of things. But it's a good way to do this. It's a good paper. I remember though also that it's you can what do you say about your research? It's not like Mariana, not questions, but suggestions for another papers and another researches. I think it's better from just question you, but our audience can question. Okay. Um, so your paper is good. It's a good subject. It's a thing that we have to think about this, because all the environment thing, it's a substantial subject in international agenda. And for international organizations, this kind of thing, it's in their they order, or they have to think about carbon emissions and other things in their diary activities. So it's a good thing to think about it. I just say other variables for you to think about it for this kind of study. Another one that I was thinking, because it's the subject of my thesis, was about voting buying. So to do another independent variable with presence or not in Security Council, because Vreeland and Axel Dreher made a huge study uh, demonstrating that if a country is in Security Council, this country receives more money if they are not. Okay, so I don't know if in your model makes sense, or would be interesting, but it will be interesting to know about that. I think. And for uh, the thing that I was always thinking when I was reading your paper, it's that it will be a huge research, but it will be good to do. It's to make a comparison, a comparative study between this sponsored the US, that the US sponsored organizations and not US sponsored development banks, to see if they are different in this kind of policies. Obviously, now I was thinking in New Development Bank, because it's a bank that have has in their mission the environmental mission, and this is a conditionality on their loans and policies to borrow money or to enter in a project, that this project would have to be sustainable. So I think it will be a good contribution to know if, because this is a question that all of us from South and researchers of South make, is the institutions from South are making a different work that the others from North. I think in a different way of saying, I think it's not, because when we saw the subject that I have more knowledge, the cooperation, the Chinese cooperation are not so different from US. The tied projects and the tied aid and things like that they are doing this kind of things. So it will be interesting for us from South to know if New Development Bank or Asian banks that are not sponsored by US, if they are doing things different from US, or not only US but northern sponsored banks. I think it's a good paper or a research that I also have interested to see. So your model are so good designed. I don't have any comments about that, because you and your partner made a good research design. So your model is a good model with all the variables that you put in your model, and all the way that you do when the hypothesis that you constructed, all these things are good. So I don't have any comments about that. Just like Mariana, putting comments to look forward another research on this kind of thing, because we need this kind of research. We need to answer this kind of questions, that if South are doing things different from North or not. Just to think about South and the mission of Global South in international relations. I think this is an identity question, but is so important now. Like now, if now we are seeing the South, like India and China, having their importance in going so far. So we need to know if they are doing something different, or if they are just doing the same with another kind of dependence, and with another kind of vertical relationship that is not interesting for the poorer countries of our world. So I think this is a question that it's good to see. So what do you think about these comments, and what do you think about doing this kind of research in an early future from the next conference of policy diffusion? What do you think about it, Vinicius?
Okay. Yeah. So thank you very much, Juliana, for your enlightening comments. Very briefly, just to address what Juliana has just commented on. Thank you for your appraisal of the paper. If you consider that's a good way to address the question, as well as the fact that the design is well crafted. That's nice to hear your opinion on these. Indeed, we do need more and more knowledge on environmental questions, self criticism that I make to our approach, although we are quite bounded by our broader project that is to analyze the impact of multilateral development banks in several policy fields, including corruption, including growth, various fields related to public policy. It would be to verify, as I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, what are the specific provisions, and more than the specific provisions specifically, what are the impacts, the unintended consequences of some projects that are put forward by multilateral development banks. And one of the comments that I found most enlightening, from Juliana is that we should make a comparative study between US and non-US sponsored banks. That's something that I'm not doing with this colleague, Anastasia Bidenkova from Barcelona, but I have a project on my own that explores not just the China-led development banks, but also other non-US sponsored banks. We have a few of them. Two of them are, I think, quite interesting. One is the Islamic Development Bank. It's led by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has 25% of the capital of that bank. It's a tool of Saudi influence all over the Muslim world. They also sponsor projects outside Muslim majority countries. I don't have strong data for them yet. I'm at this stage trying to collect some data on the CAF. CAF is the old, let me speak now in Spanish, Corporación Andina de Fomento. It's now called the Latin Development Bank, that doesn't have US participation. It's mainly a Latin American enterprise. Outside Latin America, only Portugal and Spain are sponsors. But the data that I currently have suggests that the China led banks, although they may have the intention to be environmentally friendly, they end up investing so much in energy and particularly transportation projects, and therefore the effects are quite the opposite. Why that's the case? They are more lenient than the US sponsored banks. That's something that unfortunately quantitative methods they are unable to verify. That's why we do need more researchers, I guess, that are qualitative. Myself, I like also doing qualitative research, but as I said at the beginning of my presentation, now it's quite hard to collect archives. Perhaps it's easy, not that hard to conduct interviews. We can use Zoom, we can use other platforms to be in touch with policymakers. But in that case, you do need to know policymakers beforehand. And many of them, I think, can be quite afraid of talking in this context because many of them don't want to be recorded for professional reasons. So they want to remain anonymous. So that's a huge limitation. But for now, I can say that at least the NDB, the BRICS Bank, has two-thirds of their projects of its projects related to either energy or transportation, what increases the chances that carbon emissions, instead of decreasing, they actually rise in the aftermath of those projects. For the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I haven't started yet working on this data. Nevertheless, it's quite interesting that most of AIIB projects are conducted in partnership, are deployed in partnership with either the ASDB, the Asian Development Bank, that is sponsored by the Japanese government and the U.S. government. Those are the two major sponsors. They on each or each around 15% of the bank's capital. So pretty much one third of the capital is owned by U.S. and Japan. So they really call the shots in that bank, not China, but China is willing to partner with that bank through the AIIB. The AIIB is also a huge partner of the World Bank, so we can hypothesize that because of that, they are willing to, at least in the paper, to stick with the norms, with the environmental policy frameworks that are put forward, that should guide the action, the loans, the technical projects from U.S. Sponsored banks. I think I addressed all major points. Last but not least, certainly other variables could be considered in a separate paper that has already been published by the International Studies Quarterly, a journal in the field of international relations. We use vote buying as a kind of dependent variable, but not for the environmental question. That's a very worthwhile suggestion. We may add that variable. I don't think it will be hard to recode and adapt that variable for our designing this specific paper. Perhaps in whenever in the years that there is this membership of UNSC developing states, they are more likely to comply with environmental norms just because they are willing to receive more resources. Could be something like that. I have to investigate that better. That I think could be a separate paper. And yeah, this is pretty much a paper that reports our basic initial findings. So I think, yeah, I totally agree. Last but not least, I think it's worth agreeing that I think the core of the agenda that we should advance when discussing North-South relations and South-South relations, of course, in terms of development cooperation, is to verify whether the South has something different to offer vis-a-vis the global North. I would say that at least as far as development projects are concerned, perhaps the global South has a more traditional conception of development, more focused on heavy infrastructure, all those things that China, I know that it can be a kind of stereotype, but at least data from the NDB, the New Development Bank, is unequivocal in that regard. There is a huge emphasis not on small projects, on development of communities, but instead on big projects, infrastructure, energy, and transportation projects, and not in small questions or in, let's say, deliverables, projects that are more likely to target the immediate needs of the population in issue areas like health, even small farming, small enterprises, or even education. That's something that, at least multilaterally, China and her allies from the BRICS, they have not done through the New Development Bank based on the data that I've collected for other projects I'm engaged in. So thank you very much again, and I look forward to hear other questions here.
Okay, thank you, Vinicius. Anyone from audience have any questions to our panelists? The last opportunity. So I think if we don't have any questions on the floor, I, in the name of Osmani and all the conference staff, I would like to thank all of you to this delightful evening here, even in Brazil, like you heard. We are having our summer storms with thunder and all the things, but we've passed it. We passed through this now, and we could do all the things that we are planned to do this evening. So one more time, I would like to thank all of our audience, Osmani and Miwa and Mariana, Vinicius for their papers, and for all of you, I would like to invite you for our another panel of this session in, like I said, in 4th February, so 2 days ago, in like 17th p.m. GMT, to about South-South cooperation and international organizations. So I would very pleased to have you there one more time with more questions, with more discussions, okay? Thank you for all, and goodbye.